Mr. Haidari is one of the very, very good poets. He writes ghazal mostly, and Mr. Sahib as well.
Well, you have read to me some poems in Farsi. I do love to hear them.
Yes.
You can learn a lot just by.
Just want to say hi to Mr. Donaldson. I think last time I said hi, he was away.
Yes, I don't
Looking
see you
forward
popping
to
up on the screen
learn
there,
a
but I
lot
do
from
hear a
him.
voice.
Okay, so the person who was speaking, his name is Jamshid Haidari.
Oh, that was Jamshid. There you
Yeah,
are.
Jamshid,
Okay,
one of the
Yes.
very, very good poets.
yes, hello.
Thank you. Hi. Very great to see you, Mr. Donaldson.
Pleased to meet you. I'm going to get me some of those earphones. You often see people with the earphones. That must help with the audio, I'm imagining.
Yes.
If you have 4 kids at home, for sure it will help.
Yes.
سلام به همه.
سلام شگفت جان.
خوب هستین دوستای عزیز. فکر میکنم که پیش از اینکه احوال پرسی کنم فکر میکنم کمریم رانگ سایت نشان میده.
I also welcome Professor Donaldson to this wonderful event. This will be our first English event taking place at the Toronto Cultural Hub. I just want to mention that the Toronto Cultural Hub is not a good translation for the Farsi name we have for our organization. It mostly focused on seeing us as a house of culture in Toronto, something like that. So welcome to the wonderful event that are going to be talking about metaphor. So, thank you. I would like to speak a few words about Professor Donaldson, and then we officially start our conversation on metaphor. I actually forgot to welcome all participants in this program. Thank you for taking the time and participating and giving us the opportunity to have you with us. Okay, so Dr. Donaldson is a professor of English literature and the chair of poetry at McMaster University, and a very well-known poet in Canada. He has published books of poetry. I lost track of the numbers, a very good number of poetry books, and also several important books on poetry, especially metaphor. This is the latest book of his on metaphor called Missing Links. It's a book of almost 500 pages, focused on metaphor from very different perspectives. We're going to use part of this book to understand and define metaphor today. And also several other books that we may mention today. Okay. Professor Donaldson, I would like to begin from a very literary perspective. As I mentioned earlier, most of our attendees will be from the area of literature and poetry. So in your book, Missing Links, you use the analogy of a ferry, a ship carrying a cross. You say metaphor carrying a cross, or you focus on metaphor as transferring meaning. In a very literary perspective, how would you define metaphor?
Thanks for reminding me of that. The moment in the book where I go back to the root of the word. I'd forgotten that is a place where one can begin, right, with the taking the word itself apart from the original Greek meta, meaning across or beyond, and pherein, meaning to carry, or and we have it in English still, that root in the word ferry, to ferry someone across a river or something, that comes from the Greek, and so that notion of crossing over is central to most of our ways of understanding metaphoric thinking. But you know, even before I venture a definition, I think the generous comments that you've made and that our host has made have already sort of given us ideas of how metaphor and metaphoric thinking works. In the comments that he was making, he used the word when we were talking about your organization of bridging. I heard him use that word. I also heard him use the term bringing together.
Yes.
Which is wonderful, and the idea of cultural interaction or cultural reciprocity of moving between cultures, and then we were talking, or you were talking just briefly about differences between languages, right? And your generous invitation to me to come and speak today in English, and you'll be translating this into Farsi, and there will be the very interesting relationships between the two languages through that translation. So already we were sort of talking about metaphoric thinking, because it is about all of those things. It is about moving between spaces. It's about using a certain activity of mind, a certain property of mind that is hardwired into our brains, of making associations between things. And there are many different ways of talking about that, but that activity of even if you just take the brain that has synapses, the synapses are, there's one neuron and there's another neuron, and there are neurotransmitters. I think our doctor might help us here. There's the passage between the two neurons, and that somehow their identities are linked by a space of energy between them that is activated by a cascade of energy. That itself is another kind of metaphor, of course, and our brains are just given to it. But to step back and think about it in the terms that we've begun with, that is of literature, and how we think of metaphor as significant in poetry. I think a good place to start is that poets generally don't need to be told much about metaphor. They live and breathe it. It is the modus operandum of thinking in a poem, finding the connections between things that will surprise, that will actualize and make real something that wasn't before the connection was made. Poets understand this. I think one of poetry has its place in the world, and generally poets are kind of mopey about that poetry is not as appreciated or celebrated enough in the general culture as it should be. I think we all can feel that way, and it is possible to link attitudes towards metaphor itself to that let's call it a kind of marginalized place of literature and imaginative thinking and poetry. We can link to that. That is, poetry has metaphors in it, and that's generally what people think of when they think of metaphor. That metaphor is a nice way of putting something that is different from what is really true. That tends to be how the general culture will thinks of metaphor. And in that sense, it's always subordinate in our general culture. I'm imagining that it would be the extent to which this is true would differ around the world. And I think it's quite possible that there is a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding and celebration of metaphoric thinking in Afghanistan than there is in North America. Certainly in North America, there would be this sense that metaphor is a kind of polite way of putting something if you can't really describe it in more accurate terms. That we use metaphors. We use metaphors in the sciences. We use metaphors in any kind of descriptive thinking to try and get at something. But it's more or less it's a polite way of being more or less wrong. That's how we think of metaphor. And poets themselves can be subject to this kind of assumption themselves if we're thinking of metaphor as simply one thing being compared with another, and you use them in poems, but we don't really see them anywhere else in our lives, and so it has a very special and particular use in certain moments in life.
May I interrupt you, Dr. Donaldson?
Yeah.
We would like to hear more of a sort of focused approach to metaphor in relation to, for example, something like simile. Simile is a technique that most of poets use. What happened to a simile? And we also know that metaphor is a type of simile.
Yeah.
What happened?
That's very good. That's a distinction that some people don't quite understand. That is that a simile is a form of metaphor. They'll say, oh, this is a metaphor here, and that is a simile there, and that gives metaphor an even more specialized definition. But a simile is, in a sense, a kind of concretized metaphor. When you say, my love is like a red, red rose, you're using, we say, okay, that's a simile because it's a comparison that uses like or as. But then you can also have metaphors that simply drop the like. Alexander Pope saying, this long disease, my life, right? He's not saying my life is like a long disease. He's saying this long disease, my life. Or Joseph is a fruitful bough, something like that. And you'll have often enough the use of the copular verb to be, which is really making no bones about the connection that you're making between one thing and another. This is that. And that kind of radical metaphoric thinking lies at the heart of what we call simile, which is a slightly more apologetic way of making a connection between two things. You're thinking in more or less rational terms, that I can't say Joseph is a fruitful bough, a person is a person, and a tree is a tree, and I'm not going to be so silly to say that these are the same thing. I'm not going to be irrational. I'm going to say this is like that thing, and so you're making a concession to a rational way of inhabiting the language. And so what that deferral to the authority of rational language is all through, we can see it all through literature. But literature itself shows that that ways of thinking about metaphor are much wider than that still, and that there is an instinct in our minds that has no difficulty putting two things together and simply saying that one thing is another, right? You could say, you know, my life is a watch. Mm-hmm. Right? And then suddenly the mind goes to work. What does that mean? My life is a watch. And we're not like computers where, you know, where it would flash on the screen, you have committed an illegal operation. You cannot put these two things together. No, our mind, we don't shut down at that moment. We become curious. We're activated. We're suddenly, oh, his life is a watch. How does that work? Let me see. Let me follow that into possibility and see where it takes me. So that distinction between simile and metaphor, for me, it's not so much a false distinction as it's simply one that one can see arising in the culture because there is this other use of language that dominates, and that is rational language, where we will say, oh, I won't think in radical metaphoric terms. I'll make a concession to the favoring of rational language and say that this thing is like that thing. So that gets us started there on just that basic distinction.
Yes. Yeah, so to just continue where you dropped. When in simile we say this is like that. Yes. And in metaphor we don't say this is like that. We say this is that.
Yes, that's right.
Or this is equal to that.
Yes.
So I would like to draw your attention onto differences between the making as a similarity. Yes. In simile. Yeah. Whereas in metaphor, we are not making a similarity. We're making a equalness, yes. Sort of a, yeah. We're bringing this to, so relating two unrelated items and making them as equal as one. Yeah. So if you could reflect more on this difference, is the this is that, and this is equal to that.
Yeah, very nice. We can go to both. We can spend more time with both sides of that, with the simile and the metaphor purely defined. But yeah, this is that. We can start there. We call that radical metaphoric identification, right? Where again the fact that you are saying something that is essentially a paradox, mm-hmm. right? We live in a world where everything is itself, right? We believe that everything is itself. Physics, of course, nowadays tells us that even that assumption is problematic, that everything is only allowed to be because of other things that are not it, and so on. You can get into very complicated language trying to understand physics at the theoretical level. But metaphor takes this assumption that we have that there's one thing and there is another thing. You call it A and B. And we're going to say that A and B are the same thing. And when you scratch at that a little bit, you see that it's a paradox. It's a problem that can't very easily be worked out in rational terms. When I'm teaching one of the introductory classes on metaphor, I'll do exactly that thing that you were suggesting, where you put two letters up on the screen and you'll either put an equal sign between them, or you put an is. And I put them both up there and I say, what's the difference between these two things? Is there any difference between saying A is B and A equals B? And students will play around with that a little bit. And
So what do you think? He's right or not?
we end up, often talking a little bit about, mathematics. You're trying to find another language for saying, well, they amount to the same thing. They have the same values and so on. But the more we talk about it, the more we discover you can't escape from this idea that you're trying to include them both in a unity, in a oneness, in a singularity. And so in some ways the equal sign is a bit like the like, because it's trying to rationalize something that in its purest form with the verb to be is simply nakedly paradoxical, saying that two things are one thing. My love is a red, red rose. And it's the poet who seems to intuit best, most deeply, that this is not a problematic way of describing the world, but actually a doorway that leads into possibility, otherness, the unseen, spiritual understandings of the world, ideas that point in the direction of something other than the assumed or the rigidified, the calcified, the objective. Suddenly the poet comes along and says, we move around in this objective world, but if you think of it in this way, ... all things are possible. All things are possible. And the poem is usually an exploration of that.
Yeah, I would request our participants, would you please mute your mic in order for us to have a better conversation. So when Dr. Donaldson, when we say this is that, or this is equal to that, or A is equal to B,
yes,
do you see a tension, a conflict between A and B?
Yes.
A tension in the sense that we say that A is B or A is equal to B, and at the same time we know that they're not.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah, okay. I would like you to reflect some more thoughts.
And what you're taking us back to there is the problem of the gap, of the between wheres, of the middle ground or space, that place where we would say that some kind of energy is being exchanged between two things, and we want to find a metaphor for what that energy is. And so we'll say, let's use the metaphor of the equal sign. That will help us to understand what's going on there. Or let's use the metaphor of the verb to be. That could help us understand what's going on there. Or let's use the metaphor of likeness and then see if that doesn't help us. But it's the mystery of how things relate to one another and what happens in that space of relation that a poem, possibly more than any other form in language, is always inviting us to confront. But just to step back to that issue of the problem of relation itself. There's the American philosopher, I think he was American, maybe English, the American philosopher Max Black, who came up with the notion. He was a mathematician, and he came up with the notion of associated commonplaces. And an associated commonplace is all of the things that you would associate with any object. So if you say, my love is a red, red rose, you would take the idea of a rose, Max Black says, and you would understand that there are all kinds of things that we understand about roses that help us that define it. So you can say roses are thorny, roses are red, roses grow out of the ground, they grow in the summer, they smell really beautiful, they drop their petals in the fall, they require a lot of water, they open up towards the sky, potentially infinite number of associated commonplaces that one could make. And essentially what a poet is doing when a poet creates a metaphor is that you're suddenly, and this is a problem of language, but you're either creating or discovering that there is a relationship between the associated commonplaces themselves of the two objects. So for instance, when you say, my love is a red, red rose, we could talk about that. We could say, well, what do we mean when we say, my love is a red, red rose? And we say, well, my love is beautiful, so is a rose. My love is mortal, and so is a rose. My love smells good, and so does a rose. My relationship is a little bit thorny, and so is a rose, right? And you recognize, oh, okay, yeah, now I see why my love is like a red, red rose. And the genius of the poet is it's that activity of you're writing your poem and you come to a moment and you say, my love is, and the mind reaches into a gap where it is open to the discovery of possible associated commonplaces coming together. And it's at that moment you, oh yes, my love is a red, red rose. My love is a gem. My love is a tree, I could say out the window. And there would be what we call entailments from that. There would be consequences of making that particular connection.
Okay,
right?
so Professor Donaldson, we have a question among our audiences. Mr. Mohakik has a question for you. After his question, we will, I would like to continue on the associated commonplace as a practical ground for poets. So let's see what Mr. Mohakik has for us. Mr. Mohakik, can you?
Hello, everybody. Happy to see you all. And hi, Dr. Donaldson.
Hello.
I'm very happy to see you again. Unfortunately, my cam is broken. So I hope you hear me.
No worries, I do very well, no worries.
As you know, I'm coming from a translation background, and your definition of metaphor raised this question in my mind that if we accept this definition that metaphor is when we say A is B,
yes.
When we translate metaphor into Farsi, actually we use an Arabic word, which is استعاره. And the literary meaning of that term means borrowing. Ista'ara means
lovely.
Borrowing a term for conveying another meaning.
Yes.
So the problem is that when we are translating, particularly the religious text, for example, Quran, sometimes even the definition of metaphor becomes problematic. For example, we have a verse in the Holy Quran that says, Yadullah ma'al jama'ah. It means, if we translate it, it says, the hand of God is with the community.
Yes.
So the problem here is that some say, okay, it's crystal clear. It's a metaphor, and it wants to say that God will help the community. It promotes unity.
Yes.
But some people, they do not agree. They say that it is not a metaphor. It's just a statement.
Yes.
And this leads the discussion of God's incarnation and makes understanding the rest of the Holy Quran problematic.
Yeah.
My question, to make it short, is that is metaphor in a text, or discovering metaphor in a text, is crystal clear? I mean, are there certain criteria to decide whether something is a metaphor or not? And if not, what then can do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There would be lots of reasons that one might want to constrain the explosion of meanings that derive from any two words that are put together, or two different terms in two different languages. There's always an opening up into possibilities, and there would be reason to try and constrain that in order to have unity, in order to have community or consensus. We want to say, well, let's understand that it's this. Let's draw a circle around what we understand by these words. But metaphor itself is usually, I mean, there are different operations of language that we have to do that constraining. We call it logical or rational thinking, or we could go back to the history of the words and try and sort things out. But metaphor usually doesn't favor that kind of either or thinking, that the metaphoric imagination itself is always both and, right? How can we contain in our minds the possibility that both of these things are true? In exactly the same way that when you say, my love is a red, red rose, daylight lies on the bed like a fresh shirt, all these strange metaphors. How are we going to use our imaginations to try and understand that both of these things belong in the one thing, right? And so the term that you're describing, or the hand of God is with the community, and some people want to understand that as literally true, and some people want to understand that as metaphorically suggestive. But then the metaphoric imagination then comes along and says, is there a way of thinking about the problem of metaphor itself that includes both of those? That it helps us understand that it both is and is not. That's always what a metaphor is saying. This is and is not this thing. That both of those things are true at the same time. And does that make our brains burst, right? Because we just don't know how to. But that's the challenge of metaphoric thinking, is the possibility that two things can be one thing at the same time. And it is, after all, true. If you take a problem like the translation of that term, those two things are united in the problem of the word itself, right? The problem of the word hand, for instance. And those different views of what the sentence means both inhabit that singularity, that one thing. And that's a metaphoric problem.
Thank you, Dr. Donaldson.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I'm very happy to see several hands are up. They have questions, so we're going to continue giving the opportunity to our audience to ask their questions. We'll start from Ms. Shugufazia, please.
Shugufa.
Thank you, Dr. Mahdavi. Dear Professor, I have written a short piece. I want to read it for you, and then I will ask my question because it relates to that.
Sure.
When you open your magical feathers of poems and cast your spell on me, before noticing, I find myself in possession of you. In this piece, I didn't mention the person is a peacock, or in our language, tawus. But I gave some hint and leave it to the audience to find out what kind of person he is. Now, I know that I have used some metaphor, but I didn't give the real name of the metaphor, but I give some clue and leave it to the audience. So what kind of metaphor is this? I didn't use the simile. I didn't use the basic metaphor you said, but I don't know what kind of metaphor is this.
Yes.
Can you help me?
That's a very interesting problem. In some ways, it is native to metaphor itself to create another thing that is hinted at in the formula that you've come up with, as for instance in your lines, which are very interesting. And so I often just use in class this metaphor. I think I just spoke it a minute ago. Daylight lies on the bed like a fresh shirt, right? That's a strange metaphor. But we could feel that that what Walter Benjamin, he's the author of that line, what he was getting at is mysterious, right? There is that state of mind that he wants to put us, the reader, in when we read daylight lies on the bed like a fresh shirt. And we have to try and find out what that is. So we follow after it, we pursue, we do more thinking about what could possibly be the resonance of that metaphor. And that's what you're talking about when you're thinking you've got an idea of a peacock as suggested by the language that you were using, and it's then a question of whether you've provided enough. We could go back to the associated commonplaces, but whether you've provided enough links between the words that you are using, such that they will point the reader in the direction that you want them to go. And sometimes a poet will have a very definite idea of where they want the reader to go with their metaphor. And at other times, they'll just think, oh, that's so crazy, that metaphor. I don't even want to try and make it, I don't want to try and put it in other words what that means. I just want it to be surprising and to jolt us out of our understanding of how things are. But there is what I think your poem belongs to is an old tradition. It may exist in Farsi as well, called the riddle poem, where what you're actually doing is providing clues, that the metaphor is the set of clues that you use, and that's your solution. You're reading the metaphor and you're saying, oh, peacock or something like that, is the answer to the riddle. And it's always the piece that is missing. And exactly as your poem was, it'll be very small. The riddle poem is usually 2 or 3 lines long, and it will just have a few clues. It works just like a riddle does. And it's inviting the reader to follow after and discover the thing that is missing from the words themselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Sia, and thank you, Professor Donaldson. We have another participant who is Hadi Miran, a very good poet. He's speaking to us from Kabul. Mr. Miran, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear it.
Okay, yeah, please have your question.
Hello.
Yes, hello everyone. I would like to thank you, Mr. Dr. Mahdavi, for preparing this opportunity, as well as Dr. Jeffery Donaldson for his very interesting and instructive explanation about metaphor. So I have two small questions. The first one is something that is metaphor today in terms of time and room. Does it remain metaphor for tomorrow also?
Oh, yes.
And my second question is that, is there any connection between metaphor and symbolic interactionism?
Yes.
This was my question.
Yes. Shall I try to respond then? You're absolutely right. The language is constantly changing and evolving. The time in which a work of literature or a religious text was written, there will have been conditions of language that would be present to the scribe or author at that time, and the writer might have certain intentions I want to do this and this in this work. And then the language changes, of course, and sometimes the intention of the author is lost because we no longer inhabit the condition of mind in the language that the original author inhabited. And we can feel that as a loss. But one of the things that we have discovered is that in all literature, in all languages, is that the best and most interesting works are those that continue to evoke possible understandings, even when something might be lost. Maybe we have to be reminded that in an earlier century, this word meant this and this, and we can include that in our conversations. But out of that understanding of the historical possibilities of the word, we discover new possibilities, right? So we live in a later time when that phrase would actually mean X, Y, and Z. And now that too is included in the richness of the text. And the other implication that I think you were touching on there is that attitudes towards language itself, not just the meanings of words, but attitudes towards language itself can change, such that one of the debates that our earlier questioner was talking about is, is hand meant metaphorically or is it meant literally? And when one is favoring one or another of those understandings, you're saying something about how you think of language in those terms, right? You think of language as being more literal than not, or being more metaphoric than not, where you're showing something about how you think of words generally. So it's a very difficult thing to pin down. And again, there are reasons for us to not want things to get so out of control that we're just dizzy with possibilities. And yet at the same time, it does seem that metaphoric thinking it is the energy of mind that keeps things open, that preserves the element of possibility in meaning itself.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Donaldson, and thank you, Mr. Miran, for your question. We have one more question from our audience, Mr. Ali Hosseini. Please have your question.
Hi,
Hi,
everybody.
Ali.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thank you for being here, and thank Toronto Cultural Hub for arranging this meeting. My question is about the use of metaphor in non-literal, mostly social science and not even philosophy.
Yes.
And I wanted to hear about the philosophical perspective on use of metaphor in language and how metaphor can convey us to truth or to reality or to knowledge. And
yes.
We understand that the language is very hard or impossible to regulate. So it's a good advantage. So it helps language to evolve and to, but at the same time, since metaphor may not bring us to truth or reality, what are philosophical debate on the issue of metaphor being as a tool to convey us truth and knowledge, and you can also I appreciate if you also shed some light in broader use, because in our culture metaphor is mostly used in context of language and poetry, and very limited in some other languages like English. It's so broad. Thank you if you shed light on a broader use of metaphor in non-poetic contexts, especially social sciences, even politics.
Yes.
Thank you.
there are two things that I might say. The first is kind of goes back to the challenge of metaphoric thinking itself, that things can always be other than what we imagine them to be, that opening into possibility, and that there is a sense in which the challenge of the metaphoric mind is that that is a form of truth that is alternative to the kinds of truths we imagine we are trying to ascertain through logical thinking, argument, cause and effect, rational argument, and that we mistake the relationship between those two possibilities if we think of only of the one as being the truth, and that metaphor will come in at a certain point to help, but it's not a form of truth itself. So that's one thing that metaphor might challenge, that problem of metaphoric thinking is so true of the human mind that we must make room for it in order to get to the truth, whatever we imagine that to be. But the other thing that you're asking about has to do with how metaphor can help in something like an argument or a theme that's being pursued, say, in the social sciences, where Paul Ricoeur has, in his wonderful book on metaphor, he's probably the premier theorist of metaphor. His book, La Métaphore Vive, in French, was translated into English in, it's called The Rule of Metaphor. I don't know if it's been translated into Farsi. It was published in the 1970s. But he speaks directly to the question that you've asked. And he says that there is a form of conceptual thought, that's the term that he uses, which is trying to get somewhere. And that at certain points in an exchange, in an argument or a debate or a conversation, you hit a wall with the cause and effect links that you're making to get to where you want to go. And when you hit that wall, he said, conceptual thinking itself breaks down, and that what can help at that moment is a metaphor. And that what metaphor does is, at that moment when conceptual thinking has reached an impasse, that metaphoric thinking obliges you to think more. That's the only phrase, that's the phrase that he uses, and it sounds oversimplified, but it's a central part of his argument, that you're thinking, you hit a wall, you need a metaphor. And as soon as you introduce the metaphor, the mind opens up into more thinking. And that possibility of more thought at that moment is the thing that metaphor can do in conceptual argument that you're describing. So it can just as a useful tool when you're having a conversation with someone and you find that you've hit an impasse, you're not speaking the same language, you have differing views that clash in these ways and so on. Ricoeur's belief is that a metaphor at that point can generate possibilities that you didn't see were there before you used the metaphor itself.
To make sure that it's clear, at least for me, but also for other audience. So metaphor is here, it works as a creation tool. It opens new horizon. The moment you hit the wall, then your next aim is another wall and another wall. So creating more and more space. That's as a way to create. It's to open horizon.
Exactly.
Without any end to it.
Yes. Yeah, no, very nice. That sense of infinite possibility that you're describing there is the charter of metaphoric thinking. That is its essence. It is, you take one thing and another thing and you put them together, and a third thing arises. It's a creative, generative event that occurs whenever you think metaphorically. And that creative possibility is potentially infinite. And that is a kind of saving grace when we're thinking of human society and culture and communities, to have a tool of mind and imagination and language that is continually opening up into possible identifications. I think it's if we needed some guarantee that the human destiny is hopeful, has futurity, I would be pointing to that possibility of the imagination to discover new possibilities using the tools of the human mind itself.
Thank you, Mr. Hosseini. Appreciate your thoughts and your question. So let's continue where we just left off. The thoughts that Paul Ricoeur defines metaphor as the possibility of thinking more.
Yes.
Or as hopefully I remember correctly, as semantic shock.
Yes. Very nice.
And so we have a gap, a semantic gap between two items, and we fill this gap using metaphor. So having said this, I reminded George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, yeah, on their beautiful work called Metaphor We Live By.
Yeah.
They say metaphor is typically viewed as characteristic of language alone, a matter of words, rather than thought or action.
Yes.
And what you, in your book, Missing Link, focused on and explained metaphor, it says this regarding metaphor as a matter of meaning.
Yeah.
And what we just mentioned, Paul Ricoeur, he is also referring to metaphor as it's happening something in the area of meaning.
Yes.
So my question is meaning different from thought?
Is meaning different than thought? Boy, that's a good one. I'm going to understand the word thought as more original, that thought is an activity of mind. There's the wonderful little riddle in James Joyce's Ulysses. I think it's Stephen Dedalus who says, thought is the thought of a thought. And he's trying to puzzle that out. Thought is the thought of a thought. But we call our activity, the activities in our brains thinking, and we call the products of thought, we can call them thoughts, but we could also call them meanings. And when we say meaning, I think that we're constraining the idea of thought down to something that is more particular. You know, thought isn't saying that it holds together or that it makes sense or that it's a unified argument. We tend to think of meanings in those ways. What do you mean? And then you have to say, well, I mean this, and you're gathering your thoughts together. Whereas a thought is the generative process itself. But what Lakoff and Johnson.
Yeah, so let me clear that part. That Lakoff Johnson says that the metaphor is a matter of words, not a matter of meaning. How do you?
They define metaphor with some constraint, possibly not just saying that it's words, but that they are metaphors, that we live in a world that is informed and essentially defined by unconscious metaphors. So just for an example, I'm speaking right now and you are following me, we say, right? And Lakoff and Johnson come along and say, well, do you see what metaphor you are using there when you use that word follow? We don't think we're speaking metaphorically at all, but the metaphor that I just used there is argument as journey, right? Oh, I can't follow you. Oh, don't get ahead of me. Oh, wait, you're leaving me behind. Hang on, let me catch up. All these different terms that we'll use that belong to this encompassing idea that when you have an argument with somebody or make an argument, you are on a journey, you are traveling to a point, and so on. I think I see where you're going, and so on, we would say. And so the discoveries that they had made were brilliant and fascinating, and it's a book well worth exploring just to understand how comprehensive this activity is. But the other side of it is, how is it that the mind does that work? How is it that the mind that we're okay saying, I can't follow you, or I see where you're going? How is it that we can think metaphorically without our brains crashing? And that's the area that I was interested in, and it's the area that I think would be more intuitive to poets and creative thinkers generally, who are curious about how the mind actually does this work. And what I ended up doing in Missing Link is I was trying to track that activity of that we call metaphoric thinking back to the material world, so that we could understand that evolution itself, with this narrative of mutations, two genomes come together and they produce something that is a mutation of the original, and that's a bit like a metaphor, because that mutation then opens up into new possibilities, so that mutation theory itself is a bit like the exploration of the problem of metaphor. And then the evolution of the human brain itself via, step back, chemistry. You take two chemicals, you take hydrogen and you take oxygen, and you watch how the electrons of those two interact with one another, and you say, this and this put together makes water. And we call that thing that is created when you discover a relationship between two chemicals, we call that water. That's a bit like a metaphor too. Two elements come together, they have a space of shared exchange, and then something happens. And we essentially live in that world that is the thing that happens when those two things come together. And so I just argue that this activity, the strangeness of relation itself, is all around us in the material world. And our minds are actually a product of that. Our minds are the way they are because the material world is the way it is. And we, in that sense, are a kind of fulfillment, a making conscious to itself something that is already built into the material world. That is the mystery of relation.
I remember, and also you have it in your book, the example of love. And so the example of marriage, we have person A and person B.
Yes.
They merge together in a marriage, in a love relation, and
exactly.
They're together, and at the same time they're not.
Yeah.
They're different persons.
Yeah.
It's fascinating ideas. So I would like to take you back one more time to Max Black.
Sure.
To make poets happy. And in terms of practical tools, how a poet can perceive and make use of metaphor. So he basically talks about frame and focus of metaphor.
That's right.
And he talks about associated commonplaces.
Yes.
If you could reflect on how two different ideas, two different names, two different things are related in terms of practical, and how would I, like, what kind of tools I have as a poet to relate two things, A and B, together.
Yes.
What concerns should I have in terms of their associated commonplaces? Yeah. And what gives me thoughts on frame and focus of a metaphor?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we would want to say to reassure poets is that you don't have to understand any of this to be a brilliant metaphor maker. You don't have to theorize this. I mean, there are people, nerds who are curious about what's happening there, but poets are simply metaphoric geniuses, and they don't need to have this picked apart in the way that one can. But there are uses to understanding how metaphors work, and intuitions that you can cultivate by thinking about what's happening when you're writing a poem or you create a metaphor. I think part of it does just go back to what we were saying in the Recur book, where when you're writing a poem and you hit a block, you've found a moment where something needs to happen, you want to evoke a reality or a truth, an idea, and you don't know how to do it. And there are two things that you can do. The metaphoric imagination is simply going to go to work at that moment, and you'll think, oh, what is this like? And you can make discoveries at that moment. You say, this is like such and such, and you think, oh, is that a good metaphor or not? And you try it on. There is an element both of randomness on the one hand and predetermination on the other. Because if you say, my love is a what? And the mind goes out and it says, I'm just going to try it now. My love is a cloud. Okay, I just made that up. And why did I think of cloud at that moment? Did I create the connection between love and cloud? Or did I discover when my mind went out, did I discover that connection was waiting to be made? Because there are the associated commonplaces that, clouds are soft and lovely, and they're very high, all the things that we could say about why love is like a cloud, right? I didn't make those up. I in a sense, I saw it. I saw that love was like a cloud, and it came to me. But that whole question of, did you actually create those similarities? No, you discovered them in a way. So there's a very strange relationship between the randomness of metaphoric discovery and its predetermination, that thing was just out there and it was waiting for you to see that it was there. And that's why metaphors are potentially infinite, because there are a potentially infinite number of things out there waiting to be thought of, to be discovered metaphorically. But the other thing that you can do when you're stuck and you can't, you don't see your way past a certain moment where you need something to happen in the poem that you're writing, the story that you're telling, the argument that you're making, is try and stimulate your imagination by opening up anything, a random book, right? You just take a book off the shelf. I'll do that right now, and I'll look up the word chained. Okay, that might be completely irrelevant and off course in terms of what I'm trying to do, but I've knocked my head a little bit and say, oh, what if this word were to be useful to me? How would it be useful? And it's again, we were talking about with Ali, it's again that idea that the mind can be surprised into a discovery. simply by trying on something completely random at that moment. And so that's a kind of trick or a little nudge that you can use to try and get past the moments when you might be blocked. But by and large, you know, the process that we use when, or the active mind that generates metaphors is a kind of a mystery to us, and we don't want to nail that down too much. We want to enjoy its fruits, which is the things that we imagine themselves. We want to celebrate the fact that that's how our brains can work when we let them, and see where they take us.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one more question for you, Dr. Donaldson, and then we'll let you go. When I say John is a lion, I use a simile. If you remember in our class, I was using this example a lot. And when John is coming, we say the lion is coming.
Yes.
So we basically seeing or introducing John as a lion.
Yes.
In conceptual philosophical approach to metaphor, I would like to see how this works. We know that John is not a lion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
This negativity, this tension between lion and John is there.
Yes.
When we read poems, we see it.
Yes.
We actually approach the poetry with this introduction. We know they're lying. We know they're lying, right?
Yes. But yes. And we know by the context. Yeah.
Yes. But taking this into philosophy, it could have a different impact.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So we know that in marriage, these two persons are separate human beings, right?
Yes.
They're not, you know, in one, they're not merging together.
That's right.
So how this negativity and tension between the two works in philosophy in terms of metaphor?
Again, you know, philosophers and in the sciences and medical sciences, and there are very good reasons why we need to constrain that play of possibility. I'm not sure I want an aggressive metaphoric thinker to be building my airplanes, where you think all things are possible. And philosophy is one of those areas where you're using language in a certain way to have an argument hold together conceptually. And it's in the creative domain. It's in poetry and the verbal arts and so on, where we're celebrating this other idea of how words can be used that is not simply conceptual. That's what the philosophers are doing, and the scientists are using words descriptively. That's very important as well. But in the creative verbal arts, we give our minds over to this other possibility, that there is play, that there is identification, that there is empathy and reciprocity, possibility, all of these things that poetic and metaphoric language can make possible. So that desire to constrain would be there. But again, with recur, you would say, well, at those moments, philosophers, when you're trying to make a conceptual argument and you hit a wall, maybe what you need is a different kind of language at that moment to break past the impasse that you are confronting. And philosophers, it depends on the philosopher. Jacques Derrida, for instance, was a brilliant metaphoric thinker. He was essentially somebody who found metaphoric possibility in the paradoxes of words. And he was a great philosopher. He was very invested in that possibility of language. But then there would be other kinds of philosophers who are thinking more empirically or logically, who would be more resistant to opening those cans of worms inside an argument, right? Where you don't want all things to be possible. You're trying to say this very precise things very carefully. But you're very right. Just that one last thought, going back to the lion metaphor. You can see how much in a poem a metaphor will jump out at one simply out of the context. You don't even have to say this is that or this is like that. You simply recognize that word is being used in a curious way, and that, for instance, the Pope metaphor that Alexander Pope, this long disease, my life, he simply juxtaposed these two things. He didn't say one was like the other. He didn't say this is that. It's just we recognize from the context of these two things actually being beside one another that an identification is being made. And sometimes it can be, in actual life, those contexts can be quite confusing. Like if there's somebody that walks into the room that you don't like, and you say to your friend, oh, look at that clown coming into the room, right? And we know, because clown is not something that we would expect to come into the room at that moment, that you're speaking metaphorically. But if what came into the room was actually a man who had big shoes and a big red nose, and you said, look at that clown come into the room, there would be a literal description, right? And yet it's exactly the same words that have come out of your mouth, but the context has changed and made it metaphorical. And poets tend to be very intuitive about how to use words in context so that the reader will see that those words are doing more work than just literal work, that they're doing metaphoric work too.
Okay. I forgot to mention in the beginning that I had the privilege to be a long-term student of Professor Donaldson. I had him on my study of Masters of Cultural Studies as my supervisor, and I had the privilege to have him in my doctoral sort of supervising team. He's a great friend. I absolutely enjoyed his not only his teachings and comments, but as a mentor, as a friend. One of the blessing things that happened to me in Canada was to know Mr. Donaldson and to be connected to him and learn from him and be and have the pleasant honor to be his student. I cannot thank you enough, Dr. Donaldson, as a student, as my mentor. But I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for having this great opportunity for us, giving us the moment of deeper reflections and ideas of such as metaphor. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure, Mir saying that. I don't need to tell, I probably don't need to tell most of the visitors how important your work is. Your intuitive understanding of the worlds that we inhabit in poems is ingenious, and folks will have a chance to encounter it both through your doctoral work and your ongoing work. And I'm always going to be a cheerleader for that. You're always going to be near to my heart, and I look forward to seeing what you do with your work going forward. But thanks to all the folks who asked those very interesting questions. It's been fun to chat.
Thank you so much again, Professor Donaldson, and thank you all, dear audience, dear friends, that you took the time and attended this great conversation, and thanks for the questions that was raised, and hopefully this conversation shed more light on the understanding of metaphor in our community. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Donaldson, and it was a great pleasure to have you here, and we all learned from the discussions took place. We are all poets, but after this, we knew a lot of things about metaphor, and maybe that encourages us to be poets. And it
Thanks
was
so
a great
much.
pleasure, great discussion.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thanks for
Onwards.
your time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Please.